He woke to the taste of cold iron and pine smoke, as though winter itself had been poured down his throat and sealed behind his teeth. A low growl pressed against his tongue from the inside. Ghost's breath was white in the dim. The dire wolf lay along the straw beside him, muzzle tucked against his ribs, one red eye open, the other scar-paled. The chamber smelled of tallow and damp stone and old blood. Light from a brazier set in a niche licked the rough walls, turning frost to brief fire. Jon listened to his own heart. It beat, slow and stubborn. "I told them," a voice said from the shadows. "Mountains don't die when you throw pebbles. They only get angrier." Val stepped into the warmth's edge, wrapped in a pale pelt that made the room brighter. The torchlight found the shape of her cheekbones, the gold of her hair that was the color of summer wheat stranded in snow. She had a knife at her belt and another in her boot. He noticed such things now the way a turning hawk notices mice. That was new, or perhaps old, from the wolf in him that had been closer than breath. "How long?" His voice rasped. "A day," Val said. "Maybe less. You've been sleeping and growling." The red woman muttered. The black brothers muttered more. The drunk one, Dolorous. He sat with his back to the door and made jokes like a man bailing a sinking coracle with a spoon. She tilted her head. "You were colder than death when we dragged you in here. Now you're sweating like a man in a fever." Memory crept back with the pain, a tide touching every wound. The musk of the shield hall crushed with breath, the taste of onion and hatred in Bowen Marsh's eyes, the shocked cry when a blade slid through wool and flesh, the hiss of blood on snow. Ghost howled, or Jon did, and then there was nothing but red and cold, and a woman's voice in a language that split the air like a torch splitting pitch. Jon touched the bandage at his side. "It happened," he said needlessly. "It did," said Val. She studied him with that direct, untroubled gaze of hers. "You died like one of you South men die, with all your rules and oaths knotted around your throat. And you breathed again like a proper thing of the world. You should learn from that." Ghost shifted and set a paw on Jon's chest, pressing him down when he tried to sit. The room steadied. "Who?" "Bowen Marsh is in chains," she said. He wept as if he were sorry. "I've seen men weep after gutting an elk. The tears keep nothing alive." "Any brothers with him?" "Some ran," Val said. "Some we have. Tormund wanted to hang the lot from your wall. The black brothers who stood between him and that notion are brave, if foolish." The giants laughed. "You're red, which told them to keep their heads clear for colder foes." The brazier cracked. Jon breathed the heat, the metal tang of dying coals. He should have been dead. The thought was simple and absent of fear, like admitting the sky was blue when it was. He slid his palm down Ghost's neck. The wolf rumbled and shut his eye. "You were Lord Commander of Crows?" Val said, coming closer until he could see the faint freckles at the edge of her eyelids, the way her hair curled damp with melted snow. "Are you still that?" Jon's hand stilled. The words of the vow uncurled in him like a river unfreezing. Every link he had forged around his heart, every door he had barred. Night gathers. His death had been a door. That was an answer and a riddle both. "I swore for life," he said. "And your life ended," she answered. "Ask your gods what that means. I know what it means for mine." He thought of the heart trees, of red leaves whispering to a blood wind. He thought of Ned Stark's voice, long gone into the earth, telling a boy about duty and the shape of honor. He thought of the cold snarling beyond the wall, of eyes like pale coins and corpses that remembered to hate the warmth. If vows were doors, what had come through him? "I cannot be the watch and also what must be done," he said at last. Saying it bound it into shape. Val sat on the edge of his pallet without asking if she could, because free folk did not ask such things. She smelled of clean snow, of wool and leather, of pine smoke and something sharp like sap from a cut bough. "Then do what must be done, Snow," she said softly. "Tie things together that should have never been torn. Take hands that hate taking and make them hold fast." Her words dropped into him and did not splash. "I will have enemies on both sides." "You have them already." Her mouth quirked. Better enemies than false friends. And better a wife than a knife next time. He lifted a brow at her. You volunteer yourself so gently? She laughed. A bright, clean sound that startled the direwolf into a snort. Don't be a fool. If a woman is to be seized, as your songs claim Southmen do, you lot should at least ask her first. I am making an offer, not bowing. You want to keep my people and yours from carving each other to marrow when the cold kings come walking. I want my people to live and to be free where they live. Marriage is a way to nail boards to a house when the wind is set to tear it down. He could not say he had never thought of her. The world had been narrowed to tasks and hard choices for so long that he had learned to deny the part of him that there are old men who grumble and will follow anyway. Marry me. She leaned forward and the humor left her eyes. Not for songs. For that winter that is chewing its way south like a warg's jaw through leather. For children around fires. For food in bellies. For a line on a map that is not of stone, but of blood and promise. Jon watched his breath fog and fade. He looked into Ghost's eye and saw himself reflected in red. A man who had been two men and might be a third. There was a great weariness under his bones, the sort that feels like the end of a long run when the trail tips upward again. He had always done what duty told him. Duty now wore a woman's hair and had a knife in her boot and snow on her lashes. Yes, he said. She did not smile at once. She breathed, a breath like a runner's when a ridge is crested and a valley lies below. Good, she said. Now be quick. Quick meant bleeding and fire. He stood before a table in the old common hall while Dolorous Ed read lists in a tone that made each name sound like a jest from a funeral. He stood while Tormund rumbled and the giants shifted, while the Watch's brothers who were still held to his words because they had no other raft in sight. He stood before Bowen Marsh in chains and listened to the man's sobs and found in himself a cold pool that had no sympathy in it and no malice either, only absence. He said the names of dead men that needed to be met with judgment. Some he sent to the ice cells. Some he turned away from the wall forever, their black cloaks taken, their heads shaved like thieves south of the neck. Bowen he condemned to a rope, and when the man kissed the parchment of the old oath and wept, Jon's heart did not change. He watched until the rope stopped swaying above the trap and then turned away. It was not a thing to be proud of. It was a thing to do. Tormund told him afterward that he had the look of a man who'd been gnawed and left. You'll live, the wildling said, clapping snow out of his beard like a man beating dust from a rug. No use a king that breaks because people try to break him. Best learn to bend, like my Tormund snake. Flexible. He leered. Then his eyes softened. You're breathing. Your wolf's breathing. I'll take that for a good day. I am not a king, Jon said. Tormund shrugged his great shoulders. What you call it matters less than what you do. What he did, he began to do quickly because the weather was doing the same. Letters went south on the backs of crows and in the hands of exhausted men who did not love the sky. Some were for those who had once been his father's bannermen and were now bound to the flayed man. Some for men who were free only on the inside of their mouths and their songs. He sent for what food could crawl over the ghost forest tracks. He sent free folk bands into the ruined villages of the new gift to cut beams and dig root cellars, to put their backs into shelters that would outlast the next snowfall. He told them to take their own captains and swear their own style of oath. Not kneeling, but hands into hands, with knives peace-bound at belts and Wergild promised for blood wrongs. He had Leathers and Othel's old carpenters teach the building of palisades, ditches, gates. He had the free folk show the Black Brothers how to find game sign under ice and spin snares in spruce thickets. When men muttered, he set them to work until their mutters froze to the roofs of their mouths. Val moved through it all like someone who had been born to walk on knife edges. She took no orders she did not like, but the orders she liked she multiplied. She knew which spearwife could lead and which would lead men into ditches. She knew which boys with their first beards would listen and which would run when they saw red. She rode alone at dawn and came back at dusk with news. A white bear's spoor near the milkwater. A half-frozen clan of Ice River folk who had lost their tents and would follow anyone with fire and food. A small party with a blue-eyed child kept too long in its mother's arms before a pyre was found. She burned that child herself. She told no one to look into the smoke. The Red Woman watched Val with a face like a carved mask. When Jon told Melisandre what he had said, she did not seem surprised. "The flames have many shapes," she murmured. "Marriage is a bond used by kings and gods. You have the smell of both, Lord Snow." "Don't call me that," he said, heat rising and not from her braziers. "What name should I call you? You went where it is dark and you returned. Any name now will be too small. Jon will do." She looked past him to Val, who was speaking to Carcy's sister near the yard gate, her hands moving with her words. "She is made for cold sunlight," Melisandre said. "The sort that does not warm but shows the truth of things. Be careful where you stand. Light throws shadows." "I will stand where I must," he said. He sent Dolores Ed south with a letter to the White Knife and another to Barrowton, and haggled a truce of sorts with the mountain clans who had joined the Red King's cause, a truce written in meat and furs and the promise that giants would not step within a mile of their burial cairns. Ghost watched everything with a careful eye. Once, at night, Jon found the direwolf staring out beyond the king's tower as if the far snow whispered something obscene. In the coldest morning that had yet come that winter, when the sky was a blue blade and breath crisped into tiny stars that fell at his feet, Jon stood before the godswood of Castle Black's Sorry Heart tree. He had never liked it. It was stunted, a pale stump of a thing with a face that seemed to have sunk under its own age. He pressed his hand to the wood anyway and spoke to it like a son to a father he could no longer reach. "I am sorry," he said simply. "I will make you proud or furious. I will try to do the least harm." The face in the wood did not change. Seldom did. They wedded at the Night Fort, because Val said it pleased her to make the old walls remember what they had been built to shield, and because Jon wanted the Black Gate to hear what he swore. The Night Fort had about it a gloom that tasted of dead stories, but in its kitchens a long fire still drew, and its roof beams held. He had the old giants bring logs like bones from the haunted forest. The free folk came in furs and leather, hair braided with bone, laughing and wary both. The Black brothers who came did not wear their cloaks, not partly because of smoke and partly because of the look in the crowded eyes. A few northern men stood at the edges like wolves halted by a light they did not trust. Morgan Little with his jaw like a chisel, a Glover man with a scar on his throat and the clenched hands of a man who had seen a friend die slowly. The Red Woman stood near the oven mouth without flinching from the heat. She held her hands over the flame as if testing it for bite. It was no southern wedding. Val would not kneel, nor let Jon drape a cloak over her shoulders to claim her. She took a strip of red-dyed leather and wrapped his wrist with hers, and Tormund tugged the knot until it was tight. "2 pieces, 1 lash," Tormund declared, voice booming under the cracked vaults. "If a knot fails, both hands feel it. If it holds, both pull." The heart tree at the Night Fort was a whispering root pushing up between flagstones. Jon set Ghost's paw on it. He spoke to it again without shame, and though his voice was steady, he felt like a boy hearing winter wolves outside a shutter. Then Val spoke in a wild tongue that tossed like river spray, vows of shared food and fire, vows to fight side by side, to take counsel in storms and to dispute with knives peace-bound and eyes open. She added a vow that made the Black brothers stir, and Jon's heart stir with them, that her people would not raid south so long as they were met with fairness and land in Wergild, and that if such terms were broken, the blood owed would be blood paid in the old way, clan to clan. To that Jon answered in the language he owned, that the gift would be given in truth for those willing to build and defend it, that the Watch would open its ruined castles to mixed garrisons, that no law would be made over free folk without free folk to make it, that old gods could keep their groves and new gods their septs, but men would answer for harm done with coin or penance before they bled. There was ale and a stew that tasted of carrot and old salt pork and the last onions from a guarded store. There were salted apples as a miracle. A spear wife stabbed a man through the hand for trying to pull up her skirt in victory and then kissed him with fiercer violence. Val laughed until tears came. Jon watched her laugh and felt something unwad itself in his chest. Later, in a chamber that had held some watchmen 2 centuries dead, they were alone for the first time that day. The room was heated by a trough of coals along one wall and a fur thrown over a straw mattress that was not entirely clean. Val ran her fingers along the scars on his chest, then pressed her ear to his heart as if listening for a story. "You are colder," she said, not unkindly. "I died," he said. "Then live hard to make up for it," she said, and lifted her face to kiss him. She kissed like she rode, like there was wind in her hair and frost on her mouth and a path to be made where none had been. He found himself laughing into her throat, a quiet, surprised sound, and she drew back with a grin that made the room warmer than the brazier could. "I was wondering if your South gods took all your heat," she said. "They didn't. Call them what you like," he whispered. "They did not take my heat." He woke before dawn and watched her sleep. One arm flung over her head, knife within reach even now, her hair spread like pale fire against the rough cloth. The world could be this, too, he realized, a room and a warm thing in it, a future that felt near enough to touch, not only always distant and ice-curtained. They did not linger long in that room. The world was waiting. Letters returned with frost-flayed news. A raven from White Harbor with green wax carried words that bit like wind. Wyman Manderley spoke of fry insolence, of food hoarded, of ships frozen to their berths like bones to ice. He wondered what Jon could offer to a man who fed his people lamprey pies and plots. Another bird came from the hill country with spiny letters from the clans. They would meet him if he came with a small party and no giants. They would speak of wolves and flayed men and whether one was worse than the other. A third message was no bird at all but a rider. A thin boy on a shaggy mare, pale hair matted under a cap, from Skagos of all cold stones. The boy's lips were blue. He spoke of a bastard in white furs who'd made the Skagosi rise with him just long enough to steal salt and run. Of a girl called Arya who was not Arya but stiffened men to fight anyway because of her name. He spoke of wind that cut so sharp it took the breath and did not give it back. "That is a sad story," Val said after, not lifting her eyes from the map where her finger traced the old roads through the gift. "Not the saddest we will hear. Manderley will come to us," Jon decided. "If only to see whether he can set us against Bolton and not be the one to bleed first." He tapped the map where the Kingsroad split toward Last Hearth and Winterfell. "We can't hold here forever. The Boltons will sleep badly once they hear what we've done. If we retake Winterfell with a host of free folk, the North will have to answer a question. There will not be fences to sit on. Winterfell belongs to your ghost king, if he's still breathing at all," Tormund rumbled. "Stannis, frozen as a mountainside and twice as hard. Have you heard his men? They call him King Ice. Makes my teeth ache." "Stannis came to the wall to fight the true enemy," Jon said. "If he breathes, he could be ally. If not, there is work to do." Val scratched the map gently with her knife tip. "You take the flayed men and their friends, and I will take my people and teach them that Winterfell is not a thing to be looted but a house to be shored." She smiled without mirth. "They'll like that least of everything we ask. But they will do it if the alternative is dying in the snow with boiled leather in their mouths." They set out when the day was so brief it seemed like a breath held too long. The march south through the gift was a thing of echoes. Old farms reborn into smoky life, clan banners that had never flown from a tower snapping from sharpened poles, giants in the tree line where they looked enough like hills to fool the eye, then moved. Jon rode at the head with Ghost pacing silent to his left and Val to his right on a dun mare that bit anything too slow near her. Behind them the Watch's men in patched black. Behind them, free folk with faces like Windburn and Scarters. Behind them a cart with casks of oil and baskets of hard bread that rattled like bone in a drum. They met the first real trouble at Queen's Crown, where the lake lay under ice so smooth it was like a fallen sky. The towers were broken teeth. The village was dead. Roofs stripped, beams splintered. Tracks crossed the snow like old scratches on skin, some fresh. They found the men in the reeds beyond the ruins, 6 Freys with their tails up and their courage down. They had a child with them, too, a pale boy who cried as though it had been forbidden him for too long and he needed to be taught how. The Freys were proud until they were not. When they saw the giants, their pride cracked. Jon dismounted and spoke to them. He used a voice that would carry or calm depending on the wind. He said names he knew: Rhaegar Frey, Hasteen's nephew, fat even in the cold. another with a harelip. 2 men the boy called Lymond and Pate. He told them they were under guest right if they gave up their arms and their rage. He told them he would not let the free folk cut them for sport. The men glanced at Val and did not entirely believe him. Val unsheathed a knife and set it slowly on the ice in front of her. "Choose quick, South men," she said. "A winter storm behind us and a judgment in front. Which would you prefer to meet while still breathing?" They chose life as most do when cornered. They gave up their knives and a cudgel. They led the boy forward. He clung to their cloaks. His nose ran. Val squatted and wiped it with a strip of fur, and the boy blinked, astonished by the kindness of a woman whose eyes suggested she had slit throats. Ghost sniffed the boy's coat and growled only a little. Jon sent the phrase to the back under guard and gave the boy a sausage and a patch of his own cloak to blow his nose. He was not cruel. He would not start by practicing. That night the wind cut. They made camp in the ruins where a wall turned the gusts. The stars felt near enough to scratch your face. Jon and Val ate from the same pot, shoulders almost touching without quite. "They will hate this in Lord Wyman's hall," she said with a grin turned sideways. "They will call you man of the wild things." "I am man of the living," Jon said. "Let them call me what makes their tongues feel sharp. I will dull them." She glanced at him. "You sound like your father." He tasted the name like blood. "My father was a quiet man who did not brag. He did what needed doing and did not seek thanks." "That sounds like boasting in a different coat," Val said. "I like men who wear what suits the weather." They reached Long Barrow where the clan chiefs met them in a half-frozen ring of stones that had seen men swear in their fathers' days. Morgan little spoke for them, his breath smoking like a chimney. "You think to bring raiders to Winterfell and call it peace?" he said without preface. "I think to bring men who will bleed for these lands the same as you," Jon answered, "and who will be buried in them. I think to make raiders into neighbors by giving them roofs to fix and crops to gamble with the weather. If they raid, we will punish them. But if they farm, you will trade with them. Because there is more enemy coming than broken men and Boltons." "Aye," said an old Nori woman with eyes as quick as an ermine. "The cold men. We know. We taste it every morning in the air like a bite to the tooth." Val stepped forward. "I am Val. I am not a princess because none of us are. But when I speak, people do what I say. That is like your lords, yes?" The clansmen snorted, some nodding despite themselves. "I will tell you this. If we do not set our spears in the same hedge, all we will prick is each other while the wolves go by. Take our hands or take your chances." "You sound like Mance Rayder when he had a crown," grunted a Fen with a face like a chopping block. "He spoke pretty, and then he was beaten, and then he bent to that Red King. Where is he now?" Jon did not answer that question because he could not without moving too many shadows. "Mance broke the wall without breaking it," he said. "He brought his people to it alive. I mean to go further. I mean to make the gift not a rumor but a home. I mean to make Winterfell a fire that warms the weak without burning the brave." He looked around the circle and let his eye rest on each face as if they were boys he was correcting at sword practice. "I will need your steel. I will need your oaths that are spoken without southern words. In return you will have meat and old broken roofs made whole and giants to pull stumps. And when we go to Winterfell, you will carry our banner too." "Our banner?" Morgan Little lifted his chin. "What banner's that, Snow?" Jon thought of Direwolf Grey and Wild Free Red Flame. He thought of a field of falling snow never touched by foot. "A white field," he said at last, "with a gray wolf and a ragged strip of red leather knotted around its paw." Val smiled at him then, sharp and pleased as if he had stolen a knife from an enemy and slipped it to her unday. "Are the table." In the end, the clans agreed as they often did, grudgingly and with preparedness to claim they had not if it went poorly. He did not want love. He wanted men to stand when the dead came walking. He would accept resentment the way he accepted scars. Word came from the barrow grounds of Winterfell at last, carried by a man whose horse dropped under him at Castle Black's gate when it was all too late to save the animal a decent end. Stannis had not died, not yet. He had chewed frozen leather and prayers and had made a ring of dead men around him and watched them sit up, blue-eyed, in the night. Only the king's fire kept their arms strong enough to lift their axes. The Boltons held Winterfell like a clenched jaw around a rotten tooth washed with wine. The phrase bade. Lady's blood had been spilled there, Manderly's message hinted, and the snow itself seemed to howl. "We go," Jon told Val when she had finished reading that letter twice. Lips moving, brow folded like cloth. "We cannot wait for the cold kings to choose this ground for us." "We go," she agreed, "and we carry ropes and shovels and bread with the spears." They went. It was the kind of march that peeled the soft from men. Snow found the seams in boots and crawled up like an enemy that understood ankles. Men fell and were raised or not. Jon rode sometimes, walked more often. Ghost loped as if the ground were a thing made for him. The giants grumbled about their toes. At night the wind spoke in two voices, one of the honest world, one of something that felt like ice had learned a tongue and used it to curse them. Twice they found a body that had no face left from cold. Once they found a girl sitting under a tree, blue with frost, whose breath still came. Val held the child against her breast under her fur, and by dawn the girl's lips had pinked. Val named her Pine because the child's hair smelled like it. When Pine woke she cried, and they were all so relieved by the sound that they snapped at each other afterward, ashamed. Winterfell rose like a promise that had been broken then mended with a different cloth. The first sight of its towers under a pewter sky stopped even Tormund's jests. Smoke curled from the chimneys. On its ramparts the banners of the flayed man snapped. The snow at its base had been crushed into a filthy crust by too many feet. The weirwood in its gods would send up a plume of cold breath from the place it lived. Jon's own breath stopped in his throat. They did not storm it like fools. Jon sent men to the causeways. He sent spearwives to climb where mortar had crumbled in hidden corners, and to ease ropes over the walls in the west where men looked less often. He sent Tormund to hide giants in the mill buildings and to thump the ground until it would scar like a pelt and hold a trap if something heavy tried to run. Manderly's men met them under the bridge in the night, eyes silver in the lamplight. "I was wondering when you'd come with your wolf," Wyman's son said to Jon with a weary grin and a quick glance at Val as if she were one of the old tales walked out of the heart tree. "My father has always liked wolves. Better wolves than flayed skin," Jon answered. They clasped wrists and spoke briefly of supplies and treachery and timing. Jon saw fear in the man's face. Clean fear, like a knife that has been oiled. He respected it. They went over the wall before dawn. The cold was a blade that made clumsy fingers. Men fell and green-black broke on the snow below. Jon set his jaw and climbed and prayed to old trees and his father's eyes that did not blink when things were ugly. Val came up behind him like a ghost that had muscles. She hooked the rope with a knee and slid over the crenel with a grace that made a nameless guard halt in admiration, a heartbeat too long. Her knife found him. Jon caught him as he went down to keep the sound from being a loud argument. In the yard, the first alarm was a gate slamming and a drunk retching with fear when he saw the wolf. Then everything sounded at once. Horns, boots, the low, great voice of a giant hauling himself over a broken wall. The higher, deadly sharp call of a spear wife who had seen an opening and wanted others to see it too. The phrase poured from their quarters with blades half out, shouting their own names as if that were magic. Ramsay's men came silent and grinning. Boltons themselves were a pale cut in the lines, a held steel. Jon did not look for Ramsay. Ghost found him first. Later men would say they had never seen a man look less like a man in his dying than the bastard of Bolton did when the white wolf had him by the throat. Some would say the wolf had a voice like a trumpet. Some would say a man shouted through its mouth. For the north, for home. Jon did not hear. He was busy not dying and making his men not die too. He moved through the yard like a small storm, sword in hand, the world narrowing to the possibleness of each next breath. He did not look graceful. He looked inevitable. Val was everywhere at once in his eye, which meant she made herself be where she would matter. He saw her elbow a fry in the face when he was too loud and stupid to die quickly, and then knee him until he left the fight entirely. He saw her in the Godswood, yanking a boy by the collar away from a weirwood root where he would have tripped and been killed. He saw her stand over a fallen watch brother and stop 3 blows with 2 knives and 1 piece of luck she had earned simply by moving in a way that made the world rearrange itself in her favor. She moved with a wild's mercy, hard and without apology, and always in the direction that saved most. In the end, Winterfell was theirs because too many men within its walls had hoped for too many things and then found that hope turned on them like a bad dog. The Bolton's men saw the white wolf on their lord's face and were not convinced that a flayed man ruled the world. The Freys were better at shouting than at dying. Earl Manderly's swords rose from shadows that had been waiting for weeks to be purpose. The gates opened like a mouth that had decided it was done clenching. Jon stood under the arch with snow melting on his cheeks like tears and his breath hard in his chest, and let himself look east, past Stone, to where the gods would stood. He wanted the smell of it. He wanted to press his hand to his father's tree and tell it he was sorry he had not come sooner and not too sorry for what he had done. They buried the dead in the barrow grounds and the yard, North and free folk together, piled under stones that would not move easily in spring. It felt wrong to some and right to others. It felt necessary to Jon. Val spoke words over the mounds that were not prayers so much as statements. This one fought, this one was stubborn. This one was a fool and diehard in a way that deserved a fire and a song. The Black brothers said nothing. They were tired and their own oaths were still burning in their mouths. Winterfell was a soot-stained, broken, half-starved glory. The glass gardens were dead, their rib bones of frame black with ash. The kitchen stores were gaunt and stank a little. The great hall had seen too many uglinesses and had acquired a smell of them. But the stone kept out wind better than any tent, and a fire in the hearth was not nothing. Jon saw men warm their hands and surprise on their faces, as if they had not expected heat to behave like heat. He taught the garrison sergeants to pair men stupidly together on purpose. A spearman who cursed with crude southern jokes beside a flint-faced raider. A clan archer with a boy who had never drawn a bow once because his hands shook too much and then steadied when someone actually showed him how. He told them to trade wives' bread recipes and skin-sewing tricks and how to sharpen a spear on a doorstone. It made fights at first. It would make fewer later, he hoped, and stronger men. He set a council because Val told him to. "You cannot keep it all in your head," she said, tapping his brow with 2 fingers. "Not even yours. Let other heads strain." They met in a small chamber off the great hall with a cracked window that looked out over the training yard. Jon sat in a low chair with Ghost sprawled beside him like snow fallen from a roof, and around the table sat Tormund and a Manderly man, Morgan Little, the old Norrie woman, a black brother called Septon Celador who was sober when he realized he had been asked to decide real things, Leathers with his thick hands, a spear wife named Dalla after the dead sister who had once had a king by her campfire. Melisandre stood rather than sat. Val leaned against the wall near the window where she could watch the yard and the room at once. They argued about food and law and the price of a blunted spear. They argued about Wergild. How many silver stags for a broken nose? How many for a dead sheep? Rhaenys from the clans wanted a brown sow for a broken rib. A spear wife wanted beer for every sorrow. Jon finally said coin and pig both, and let them laugh in relief at the extravagance. They argued about the gods a little, which made the Norrie woman roll her eyes and Melisandre's face settle into the kind of stillness that meant flame ran under it. "We do not have time for all your gods," Val said then. "We have time for building. Pray while you hammer, and if your god is offended by that, tell him to come help us before he complains." "You are harsh with gods," Septon Celador said despite himself. "I am harsh with men who do not lift when it is time," she replied, not unkindly. They wrote a charter. It was ink on skin and words in the mouths of men, and Jon made it both. He had Dolorous Ed copy the words with care, and he took them to the weirwood and said them there, and he said them again in the hall where the sept had once been, and he said them once more in the yard to the gathered crowd, free folk and northern men mixed, giants listening from the edges with faces hard to read. The charter said that the gift was to be divided into tithes and wards, that mixed watches would ride its roads, that the guilty would owe labor and coin before blood. It said that hostages would be exchanged, not as chains, but as roots. A wildling boy fostered at last hearth, a Karstark girl at a lodge in the forest near Mole's town. It said that raiding south was a noose. Do it once, repay twice. Do it twice, be turned out into the snow with a brand that would keep you from any hearth. It said giants would be given wood lots because they hated stone houses and would rip them down. It said men who burned dead men with blue eyes would be given extra meat and no questions about their tears. He used the dead, ugly tale of Stannis like a plank across a rotten pit. A rider came from the lake country gurgling news like a stream. The king had been pushed to the last trees of a little island and had cut down more friends than foes that day because the snow had chosen sides, and the men he had saved him by dragging him backward through reeds while the dead stamped at the shore with empty hunger. He had gone northeast, then, as the crows fly, belly low toward Carhold. Jon closed his eyes when he heard it, because he could picture the path like a scar on the world. He sent men after, with fresh horses and a skin of sour wine and a priest's words if needed. He sent a letter, "Come. Winterfell is not your enemy. Use our fire." He did not know if it would reach him, or if Stannis himself had become a story. He did not sleep much. When he did, he dreamed of snow and the stone door in the night fort and a great white shape pacing back and forth like a keeper. He woke with a taste in his mouth like old copper. Val slept easily when she slept, which made him both jealous and comforted. Sometimes she woke and pressed her hand to his chest, and sometimes she did not. Sometimes she watched him with eyes that asked what he saw in the dark and Sometimes she merely turned and threw her arm over him because that was where her arm liked to be. Spring was a rumor men told to children. The cold was not constant. It came and went like an enemy that scouts and harasses, testing, learning. That was worse than a wall of ice. It made men loosen their belts and then get kicked in the belly. Jon kept them moving. He sent bands into the woods with orders to find and burn those dead who would not stay. He sent others with sledges to drag stone from old ruins for the building of low walls around the most vulnerable steadings. He put young men from clans who had once raided each other in the same patrol and told them to outdo one another in cutting down dead men. Men like to compete. He never forgot this. The first true test came not from the south, but from the north and the dark beyond it. It smelled like it came from under the world. A horn blew from the watchtowers at dawn, a sound like a raw throat. A rider came with his horse's sides red with whip marks that made Val drop her eyes. "The lake safety is broken," he gasped. A white wind came and walking dead with it. They broke through the garrison on the east shore. The ice cracked like laughter. Jon went himself. He took Ghost and Val and Tormund and 50 of the swiftest, plus 4 giants with spears that had once been masts. They rode and slid and ran and cursed and laughed just to keep their mouths warm. The lake lay like an eye in the land, lemon gray. The air over it had a ripple like heat, except it made everything feel slow and wrong. Jon could smell the dead now. Not rot, but absence, as if his nose had been robbed. They met the whites first. Men and women and a girl no older than Pine had been when they had found her. All of them with the slow, tireless, terrible patience of things that did not tire. Val shot the girl through the eye without pausing. "No songs for that," she said, not looking at Jon to see if he had judged her. He did not. He lifted Longclaw and remembered cold through his fingers when he had first held the steel. It was a simple memory. He moved forward and his sword told him where to be, and Ghost told him when to leap, and the giants made sounds when they killed that were deep and mournful. It was not like other battles. It was like cutting through a forest that was trying to close around him and make itself a noose. The others came after, their armor blue-white, their blades fine and wrong. They slid across the ice as if it had chosen them. Jon faced one who tilted his head like a curious crow, and then came so fast the world narrowed to the bright thin song of his blade. Jon met it with Longclaw, and a scream of pain went up like a wind from the thing's steel. The creature's eyes were a color that was not in any child's chalk. The fight was short because it could not be anything else. Jon broke the other's sword and the shards sang. He tore the thing apart and the air burned cold. When it died, everything around them breathed again. They piled the broken dead and set them aflame. They did not wait to see if any frowned at fire. When it was done, Jon sank down on his heels and looked at his hands. They were shaking like a man who had run too long. Val knelt beside him, put a hand under his jaw, and lifted it until he looked at her. "You do not get to break," she told him. "Not where anyone can see. I will not either. But we can bend." She pushed her forehead to his for a moment, a brief shared warmth in a field of ice. "We are alive. Act like it." They went back to Winterfell with smoke in their clothes and a piece of cold caught behind their hearts. And they were greeted like men, not like heroes. That was better. Heroes are for songs when food is abundant. Men are for days when the stew is thin. News came behind them. Stannis had reached Carhold, or a place very like it, and had made Karstark men swear swearable things again instead of hanging them. The man himself was thinner than a poor cat, and his eyes burned like a house where there had been an argument. He would come, the message said, if the Snows would let him. He brought with him a priest in red. Jon met Stannis in the great hall under banners that had been cleaned but not mended. The man looked like a sword, plain, honed, without patience for anything that did not cut. "You die and wear it well," Stannis said as greeting. "So do you," Jon replied, and earned, if not a smile, then a lessening of severity. The Red Priestess who came with Stannis bowed to Melisandre like a servant to a master and then ignored her. Flame people, Jon thought, and was tired. They spoke of enemies. They spoke of oaths. They spoke of kingship as if it were a tool, not a crown to be admired. In the end, Stannis did a thing Jon had not expected. He listened. The mixture of North and free folk in the yard was a noise in his ear he could not ignore. The fact of Winterfell under Jon's hand was a stone Stannis could either lift or pretend was not in the road. He did not pretend. "You would have peace with raiders," he said more than once, as if tasting the idea every time made it either less sour or more tolerable. "I would have peace with men," Jon said the last time, "because I would rather fight monsters." Stannis looked at Val a long time like a man measuring timber and thinking how it would hold a roof. Val looked back without flinching. "You choose strange queens," Stannis said, almost to himself. "We choose what lives," Jon answered. "Very well," Stannis said at last, as if it cost him an arm not currently in use. "We make a causeway in winter. We stand together. And if your wildling bride breaks this peace, then I will break with it." Val cut in softly. "Speak plainly, South King. That is what you want to say." "Plain speaking is rare," Stannis said, and nodded, as if that respect alone could hold a plank in a flood. It might. Time became measured in fires lit and patrols sent and the weight of snow on our hoofs. Jon went south as far as White Harbor with a handful of giants and a larger handful of reasons to talk. He ate lamprey pies under Wyman Manderley's unimpressed gaze and left with iron and a promise of boats come spring if the river would ever release them. Val went north into the woods to settle a dispute over a stolen pig and came back with a boy from the fens who had a gift for making snares and a laugh like a cracked bell. She brought Pine with her everywhere in a scarf of furs against her chest. Men began to call Pine the Snow Child. Women called her Warming. When Val's belly rounded, angry and joyful both, Jon put his hand on it at night with a wonder that surprised him every time. He had thought death would steal this. It had not, or perhaps Val had stolen it back with the boldness she used for all things. They named the child Dalla when she arrived, all fierce wails and fists, because names are a kind of spell and because the dead do not need them anymore. Jon cried when she latched, not out of shame but because he had not known there was that much softness left in him. Val laughed at him and then cried too when the child's tiny hand gripped her finger, as if she meant to pull her mother headfirst into her life. Ghost lay as near as he would without touching and watched with an intensity that made a guard take a step back when he passed. When the first spring carts made it as far as Moat Cailin before getting stuck in mud that had the memory of ice still in it, Jon rode south to meet them with a troop of mixed riders carrying a banner of white with a gray wolf and a strip of leather knotted red around its paw. People stood in doorways and did not spit when they passed. Children cheered because children will cheer for anything that breaks the monotony. Jon stopped to eat a bowl of thin peas with an old woman who tried to give him the last piece of fatback she had and told her no. She took it back with scorn and scolded him for being foolish. He smiled and ate it after he turned his head, because scorn is the most northern way of love. He could have died half a dozen times in those months. A spear in the god's wood under the snow. A knife at his back from a watch brother who could not forgive a vow broken even by death. A fever that laid him flat like a plank and near carried him. He did not. Val did not. Many others did. He remembered them and said their names when he stood alone. He did not seek to make his grief be everyone's. It was not a flag. It was a blanket he wore in the night and threw off at dawn. The second winter's assault came not in a battle but in 1,000 small teeth. Crops failed where they could have, which was everywhere. A caravan from the Vale found itself eaten to the wheels by wolves with their ribs showing and men willing to kill for a bag of barley that would give them 2 days of bread. Jon traded iron for food and food for oaths. He learned to count like a merchant and speak like a priest, when the village needed a marriage mended or a stolen chicken's rightful owner found. It was ridiculous and it was rule. It was peace. The others did not assent to his peace. They came again, at times of their choosing, with a confidence that presumed a future. Jon and his people taught them humility. They lit pyres at the edge of the lake country so often that the trees had to be cut farther afield. They learned to sprinkle bags of ground dragonglass on the roads where the whites would pass and watch them scream like men walking into nettles. Melisandre's fires found a use that did not frighten men who cared for gods less than food. She burned the snow off warehouse roofs before they collapsed. She despised the duty and did it anyway. That made Jon respect her, if not like her. The red priests with Stannis sang while they worked and made lords frown and spearwives roll their eyes. The letters he did not write hurt him. One to Sam, to tell him about all of this and the way the wind smelled when men had built something new and not just huddled. One to Sansa, or to a girl who had her face and might or might not have had her memories. One to Arya, to tell her that a man can let ice into him and not lose himself entirely. He did not write them because there was no raven that could fly that far through that sky fast enough to matter, and because sometimes saying a thing in your head with your eyes closed is harder and truer. A year and a winter and another year. Men stopped talking about peace as if it were a dream. They complained about it. They complained about the price of grain at Molestown, and the way the free folk sang in the evening when the drums came out, and about the smell of sheep when his people wintered inside the second story of their houses. They complained directly to Jon when they could and to the air when they couldn't. They complained and then they worked and then, at night, they slept under roofs with smoke in them and called it winter. Once, a delegation came from the south with a banner of lions ragged and stained with travel, asking if the north was ready to remember old debts and new kings. Jon met them in a room with a low fire and an open window that let the air cut through Nestor Mallister's polite words. He offered them beer and mutton pie and did not offer them his allegiance. The free folk sat in the hall with their feet up and laughed when the gold cloaks looked at the giants as if they were decorative. It was easy that day to be a wolf and a man at once. It would not always be so, he knew. That was not the important thing. Val listened to their child squeal and thought of building. He saw it in her hands when she hammered pegs at a workbench and in the way she spoke to women who had been told all their lives to leave speaking to men. "You can say what you like," she told them. "We aren't Southerners." They laughed and then said what they liked and then went home and changed small things in their kitchens that made their lives be eager without breaking the men they loved. Not all marriages could be made like his. Too many were already made or badly made. But more girls wore knives. More boys did not think knives were only for men. The wall remained a line on the horizon, sometimes black, sometimes white with rime. It remained magic because the world needed a trick that worked. Jon had men on every old castle he could man, and where he could not, he had free folk settled nearby who would run to light beacons if the dead tried their hands there. He opened the black gate to men and women who had earned it and watched them step into the night with a ragged pride. He made the night fort a hall again men wanted to stand in and not only to tell ugly stories in. He let the stories remain. When a child asked if there was a thing with 13 heads that ate nights, he said yes and told the child a better story about men who had eaten nights and then vomited them up again in the form of days. When he and Val fought, and they did, it was often about small things that carried large shadows. How long to wait before punishing a boy who had raided when his sister would starve. Whether a southern envoy should be given the good cups or the dented ones. the manner of speaking to a clan mother who believed all men south of a certain stone were liars. They fought, and then they forgave, and sometimes they did not forgive and let the grudge sit on the shelf until it was eaten by dust. She taught him the way to see a hole ahead in the snow. He taught her chess, which she found silly until she did not, and then beat him twice in a row and made love to him on the table and afterward insisted on moving the board pieces back exactly as they had been. One night, in a snow that came down gentle as ashes, Jon walked the perimeter of Winterfell's inner wall with Ghost and thought about his father's face. The long years behind him were not as long as the years ahead, he hoped. He thought of the night in the ice cell when Val had told him to marry her with the practical courage of a woman who wanted 10,000 to live and would risk one heart to do it. He smiled without knowing it, and Ghost nosed his hand. "What?" he asked the wolf. Ghost did not answer because he was a wolf and better than men at not trying to be things he wasn't. Below, in the yard, Val's laugh rang out. Dalla ran after a pup with a tail too long for sense and fell and rose and flipped hair out of her eyes with a gesture her mother had taught her. Tormund told a story about the time he had cracked a mountain with one hand and men groaned and asked him to crack a barrel instead. The Red Woman stood near a brazier, watching the flames as if she had never seen them before. Stannis spoke with Leathers about cuts of meat, and Jon felt the world jog sideways in quiet amusement. Peace, he realized, was not a thing you achieved and then shelved like a crossed sword in a hall. It was a tending. It was the oiling of leather, the checking of buckles, the shaving of splinters from spear shafts. It was a hard, faithful boredom punctuated by terror. It was people who would not have spoken to one another sharing bread and finding the same crust too hard and laughing because of it. When the third true storm came, and it was a storm with a mind, with the others walking in its eye like kings in a procession, the North met it not as a tangle of feuds but as a net. The warning fires leaped along the eastern woods and the old watchtowers. One by one, a red thread pulled through white cloth. Men rode from Wintertown and the hills and from the free folks' new villages. Women came too with knives and bows. Boys more than once shot too soon and then shot again in the right direction because an old clansman gripped their elbows and told them to sit in their knees and aim like men who aren't proving anything. They met the storm at the long low ridge north of Long Lake where pines clawed the sky and snow lay deep enough to drown a small boy. Jon put giants on the flanks where the wind was worst because the giants cursed it into submission. He put Stannis where the line was thinnest because he understood men breaking and could make them forget it for an hour. He put Val where he would have put himself if he could divide in two, where the line would waver because a softer enemy would look just there. She stood swathed in fur, Dalla's little knife on her belt like a charm, hair braided so tight nothing could catch it. She smiled without humor at the storm. They came like night, the dead men first and then the others with their clean cold cruelty, and then wind that wanted to push the living off the world. Jon recognized the fear in his men by then as a thing separate from their use. He thanked it for its warning and asked it to step aside. He cut. He moved. He called orders to men by names they loved, not names others had given them. Ghost tore a gap in the world every time he leapt. The giants used their great spears like orchard poles, plucking dead from the ranks and tossing them aside. The Red Woman sang, low and rough, to the flames she held, and they rose like creatures to obey. It lasted too long, and then it was suddenly over like a curtain pulled. The others broke. The dead fell, some gently, like tired men, some with a suck of sound as if the world wanted them back. Jon stood and waited to see if he would shake. He did not. He exhaled and it was not a cloud, not yet, not while the second wave did not come. The ridge crackled with the sounds of men who had not died remembering how to be noisy. Swords on shields. Vows spoken in a half-jest that carried more weight than oaths sworn in halls. Someone started a laugh and it spread until it turned to a cough and a spit of blood and then back to a laugh again because what else was there to do with such a mouth? Val came to him with her face wind-burned and her eyes bright and her hair full of blown snow. She put her hand to his cheek and LD him nothing because nothing needed to be said. They stood together very still. Dalla would have liked to be there to sing at the dead. She would sing later in the hall to make the hall remember it was not only for fear. That night, in Winterfell, Men drank from cups that were not all dented anymore. They ate meat that had been kept through the cold in carefully tended pits and cellars, and was not so tough it made them cry when they chewed. They looked at one another across the tables and saw not enemies but men whose names they knew and whose daughters had braided one another's hair. Jon sat beside Val and watched his people be people. He ran a thumb over the leather knot around his wrist, the one that had been tied at the night fort and never cut, only tightened when work or time demanded it. It had softened with wear. It had darkened with sweat and blood. It had not failed. His heart lifted the way a bird lifts when it finds a wind that wants it. He heard, in his memory, Bowen Marsh weeping. He heard the watch's old oaths. He lowered his head for a moment in thanks for a boy who had believed. Then he lifted his cup. "To the living," he said, and around him voices rose, free and deep, northern and wild, stubborn and rough and wrong in the most human ways, layered together until the hall shook with it. After, when the fires were coals and men lay where they fell and only the watchmen and the sleepless and the lovers were abroad, Jon walked into the godswood. Snow fell through the black branches. The heart tree leaned in like an old man in the dark. He put his hand against it and felt the cold of it as kin rather than enemy. "We made something," he said softly to it. "It is not perfect and it is not finished, but it is real." A wind moved and the leaves clicked together like teeth. He smiled. He could have said 1,000 words about the shape of that smile and been wrong. He did not try. He turned and went back to a hall where a woman he loved with an honesty that had surprised him was waiting with a child who would wake with the dawn and demand bread soaked in the last of the good stew. He lay down on furs that smelled of smoke and clean sweat and winter, and Ghost set his head on Jon's boots and sighed a deep sigh that filled the space under the table where a boy had once fed a wolf his last piece of meat and learned something about hunger. Years later, bards would sing about the wedding at the night fort and the banner with the leather knot and the day the white wolf took a bastard's throat on the stones of Winterfell. They would make the free folk into princesses or devils depending on whose purse had bought the song and who was drunk enough to clap. They would get most of it wrong because that is what time does. But north of the neck, in huts warmed with peat and in great halls with flags that did not always hang straight, men would tell their children to be quiet when the snow was falling and listen. If the fire was right, they could hear it, they'd say, the sound of a knot being tied tight by 2 hands, and the wind holding its breath to see if it would hold. It did. It held through storms and thaw and the ugly necessary business of the world. It held because people with names held it. It held because a man who had died once made a vow that was not the vow he had broken but was all the more binding because of it, and because a woman who did not believe in vows taught that vows were only as strong as the daily weave of living together. It held because there were children who learned to swear in 2 tongues and meant both of them. On a day when the sun was a low coin and the lake was not frozen for the first time in a year, Val and Jon sat on the bank with their feet in the water, boots off, boots beside them, toes numb and delighted. Dalla threw pebbles and laughed when they sank as if that were a trick. Tormund lay on his back and snored loud enough to wake the dead if the dead had not had better things to do. Ghost stalked dragonflies and ended up splashed to his chest, affronted. "You're thinking again," Val said, bumping his shoulder with hers. "I am always thinking. It's one of your worst habits and one of your better ones, which is true of most useful habits." She leaned back on her hands and let her head tip. "Say it, then stop saying it and live." He smiled. "I was thinking that there is no lasting in the world that is not made of small lasts. Every day it either lasts because we wanted it to and worked for it, or it doesn't. There's no spell." "There are spells," she said, teasing. "I married you. That made a spell. I see it every morning when men who once would have slit each other's throats argue instead about the quality of beer. That is some magic." He turned his face to her and kissed her in the soft place where jaw becomes throat and winter cannot get in. She made a content sound that he felt in his ribs more than heard. Dalla squealed, affronted that attention had been diverted from her pebbles, and flung 2 at them without malice or aim. One bounced off Jon's shin. He feigned death. Ghost trotted over and licked his face with a tongue like wet leather, and he sat up sputtering and laughing while Val clapped and the child crowed. The pebbles lived and sank. The banner cracked in wind at Winterfell. Men looked north and did not think only of fear. The line drawn by a marriage was not of stone but of hands and voices and shared bread. It is easy to end a war with a sword. It is hard to end one with a promise. Hard things that last are worth the ache. The cold would come again as it always did. When it did, there would be a net to catch it made of leather and stubbornness and chance, knotted by a woman who said what she meant and a man who learned to be two things without breaking. The world would never know what to call them. It did not matter. They knew. They had made a thing together and asked everyone to hold it, and the people had said yes why. Hands and with curses and with work. That is what a lasting peace looks like. Sometimes it laughs. Sometimes it bleeds. Sometimes it sits in the sun with its feet in water and dares winter to be jealous.